Our scripture reading continues in this passage from the actual telling of the parable to Jesus is talking about understanding the parable with his disciples. Chapter 13, verses 18 through 23. Hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what's sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100, and another 60, and in another 30. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Jesus went outside the house and sat beside the sea. And that was probably a familiar spot where Jesus often taught. It was probably also a busy spot with lots of people, fishermen and their helpers, people coming by to buy fish, soldiers and tax collectors, making sure that everyone was paying their fair share, that they were getting their part off the top. There were probably also children running around, boats coming and going. On this occasion, Matthew says that the crowd was so large that Jesus got into a boat and went out a little bit from the shore so that people could see him and hear him. He was teaching in parables. A parable is like a short story with an unexpected twist. And he said, a sower went out to sow. Now, I can't help but think about my own experience with sowing seeds, which is non-existent. I have no experience really sowing seeds. So how is it that I'm supposed to understand? How am I supposed to comprehend this story? Maybe as I'm thinking about it, the closest thing that I can remember in the last few years of my life that would compare to sowing seeds is putting fertilizer down in your yard. You know, that kind of granular fertilizer that you buy in a big bag? I use a rotary fertilizer spreader. So you pour the fertilizer into the spreader, and then you set the spreader on its proper setting, which determines the rate that the fertilizer is going to be cast out along the lawn, and then you push it along, and as the wheels turn, a little round plate below casts the fertilizer out. It spins it out in a circular pattern. And I use the rotary fertilizer because I always heard that that's the fastest way to get the fertilizer all out across the lawn rather than just a drop spread fertilizer. I remember one lawn guy said, don't use that drop spread fertilizer. When you get done, you'll only see the lanes that you made fertilizer in, and you'll see everywhere you missed. So use the rotary one. But that's been a frustrating experience for me, because my experience has been that there's nothing really consistent about spreading fertilizer with this rotary fertilizer spreader, because in the first place, the ones I get are the cheapest models, and they break about halfway in trying to use them. Right off the bat, they break, and what breaks is that little measuring thing that you turn that guides it. So you're not really sure how much or how fast the fertilizer is being spread out across the lawn. And when I'm using it, it always seems like as I start, the fertilizer just kind of goes boom, out in one big dump, half a bag full just out on one spot. Or it comes out so slowly that it takes me half the afternoon just to try and get the fertilizer spread out across the lawn. So, I get kind of crazy and I decide, well, I can get this done. And I try and regulate the speed and the spread of the fertilizer by changing the pace at which I'm walking. If I think that it's coming out too slowly, then I just start to jog around the yard with the fertilizer spreader. Or if I think it's coming out too fast, well, then I'm inching along, or vice versa. But it's a frustrating experience. The other thing that drives me crazy when I'm using this fertilizer is the fertilizer pellets, as they come out, they hit your legs. I don't know if you've all experienced that as well. And so you read all the warnings on the fertilizer bag, and you're afraid that after you get done fertilizing the lawn, your legs are just going to fall off or something like that. So you're fertilizing and you're sort of doing a dance at the same time, trying to dodge the fertilizer as it's coming out. And then those are the parts of the yard that are just really hard to get with that kind of fertilizer. That little strip that's in between the sidewalk and the street, how do you get that strip using a rotary fertilizer spreader? Because when I'm going along there, it just completely goes over it. So what I try to do sometimes is turn it on its side so that it's aiming straight down as I go down this strip. So what does that matter? I mean, what does that have to do with the sowing of seed? I think it matters sort of in this way. Because if you go buy one of those big bags of fertilizer from Home Depot, they'll cost you about $40. And if there's anything more frustrating in trying to get the spread accurate across the lawn, it's this sense that in trying to do it, you're just wasting $40 as you spread fertilizer in all the wrong places. And you begin to wonder, is it really worth my going and paying this money for the fertilizer? Am I ending up spending more money than hiring a professional to come out and do it? When Jesus says, a sower went out to sow, maybe we have some idea what he's talking about. Actually, maybe we don't, but there must have been some way in which it was supposed to have been done. A sower went out to sow. What would the people have thought about when he started to tell that story? Jesus talks about a sower who just throws seed all over the place. Kind of like Helen throwing Easter eggs here in the front of the sanctuary and calling them seeds from one place to another. This sower just walks along throwing seed out all over the place. The sower is absolutely careless. He throws seed and perhaps the wind gusts up and carries the seed where it shouldn't be. Maybe the people were thinking, this is an interesting story, Jesus, but the sower in this story doesn't seem to be very smart. Not very concerned about only sowing seed in the places where seed is most likely to grow. The sower just throws out seed. Doesn't matter whether he spent $40 on the bag of seed. Doesn't matter where he's worried about wasting it or not. I wondered, Jesus, you should check the instructions on that bag of seed there. There might be a line that tells you what the broadcast rate is, and you wouldn't be wasting all the money there as you cast out seed. But the sower just throws out seed as he walks along. Some of the seed happens to land on the path. But then look out, here come the birds, and there goes the seed as fast as they can peck it and get it. Jesus doesn't add this, but I imagine you know from your own experience with bird seed, if you throw that bird seed out in the wrong place, it's not the birds that will get it, but the squirrels. So maybe the squirrels come up and get the seed that was left over on the path. But the sower just sows out the seed. Some of it happens to land on rocky ground where there's barely any soil. Just enough soil for the seed to start to spread roots, little tiny roots that as they come out get zapped by the sun as soon as it rises, and then the seeds quickly wither and die from thirst. But the sower just walks along throwing out seed. Some of the seed happens to land in an area where there's lots of thorns and weeds, And the seed doesn't stand a chance there. It's choked to death by the stronger species. But the sower just walks along, throwing out seed. Some of the seed happens to land on good soil, where it grows and brings forth grain. Some of it produces 100 times as much grain as seed, some of it 60 times, some of it 30 times. Let anyone with ears listen. Let anyone with ears understand. What do you hear? What do you understand? What's taking root in you as Jesus talks about this sower? Is this a story about how seed grows in some places but not others? Is this a story about how you need to lose or maybe even waste some seed in order to get a good return on other seed? Is this a story about a sower who is so incredibly careless and thoughtless and wasteful that they're just oblivious to where the seed is being sown? What's the point of this sower as he sows seed? I imagine the people there who heard Jesus, just as you and I might be thinking this morning, would be that they are thinking it's reasonable to say that if you're going to sow seed in the first place, you expect something to grow. You anticipate growing something. You expect something to come forth. Therefore, it would make sense, and you would try to sow the seed in the places where it has a good chance of growing. Why bother sowing seed on the path, or why bother putting seed on the rocky ground or among the thorns? But when Jesus tells this story about the sower is just walking along, and you know what the sower is doing? The sower is being indiscriminate. The sower is just indiscriminately sowing seed wherever. Think about it. This is a sower that doesn't discriminate. The sower doesn't say, now look, here's a path. I'm not going to bother sowing any seed on the path. The birds or even the squirrels will come get the seed there. The sower doesn't say, I can't sow seed on that rocky ground sitting right back there. I can't sow seed among those thorns. What's the point of that? The sower just sows, and as he sows, seed happens to fall on the path, on the rocky ground, among the thorns, and on good soil. The sower just sows seed, and the seed goes everywhere. The sower doesn't discriminate. Good sower or bad sower? What do you think? Good idea or bad idea? Good thing or bad thing? How do you see it? Well, I would think that a lot would depend on what it is that you're sowing, what it is of value that you're casting out there. A lot of that would depend on it for me, what this is. If you're walking through a desert and you only have 1 gallon of water, I would imagine that you would be very discriminating about what you would do with that water, where you would sow it, where you would place it. Or if I go to the doctor's office and a nurse is going to take blood from me, I want that nurse to be very discriminating about how many tubes they're trying to pull out and which vein they're trying to get it from. A lot depends on what it is that you're casting out there, doesn't it? What it is you're sowing. If you're a parent, would you discriminate between your children? Would you tell one child, I love you, and then turn and tell another child, I sort of like you every once in a while? As a parent, would you discriminate that way? Would you tell one child, you're exceptional, and then turn and tell the other child, well, you're pretty average? But we do discriminate, don't we? We have to make choices. We have to choose between good and bad, right and wrong, healthy and unhealthy, what's safe, what's dangerous, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. We have to choose in situations where it's appropriate or reasonable to discriminate, in situations where it seems unfair and unreasonable to discriminate and make those kinds of differences apparent. We find ourselves caught in those kinds of situations all the time. What did Jesus do? Did he discriminate? Did Jesus differentiate? Often his actions seemed indiscriminate, in comparison to the behavior of other religious leaders. Where others withdrew, Jesus tended to reach out. Where others withheld, Jesus tended to give generously and to give sacrificially. Where others followed closely the letter of the law, Jesus often broke the law in order to fulfill the law. Where others judged failure, Jesus spoke forgiveness. Where others acted based on scarcity, Jesus produced abundance. Where others worked hard to make sure that the seed fell only on good soil, only in the places where you knew for sure it would produce something worthwhile. Jesus told a story about a sower who just went around sowing seed everywhere. But what does that mean? Does it mean that Jesus was just different? That Jesus lived differently? What are we supposed to learn? What are we supposed to understand? And if we're having a hard time understanding it exactly this morning, was it wasted on us? That silly sower who went around sowing seed everywhere? There's one little part of this story that I hadn't noticed before. I'm wondering if it makes a pretty big difference. At the beginning, Matthew says Jesus went out of the house and over to the seashore where there were a lot of people, a big crowd, a mixed crowd, and got into a boat. The image of a house is the place where the Christian community gathered at first from the very beginning. In the house, the Lord was often present. In the house, they came together and shared meals, and fellowship and friendship and relative safety. The house was where they first began to learn as Jesus taught them. But here Matthew says they moved from the house out to the seashore, out into the open, out where there's lots of people, and they get into a boat. Jesus gets into a boat, and he begins to teach from the boat. And do you remember that the boat is also another early image for the Christian community, the Christian church? The Christians so often thought of themselves as being out in a boat, in rough seas, seeing their master walking toward them, going forth out into the whole world. And in between these two images, that sense of beginnings in the house, where things were so familiar and so certain, and that image of being out in the world on the boat where they were beginning to face new challenges, going to new and unexpected places. In between those two images, Jesus tells this story of a sower who just went out and sowed seed everywhere. What do you expect to happen? You'd like for that seed to start growing, wouldn't you? You'd like for that seed to produce 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold, 20-fold, 15-fold, or even 5-fold. The seed, the Word of God, is supposed to produce. It's supposed to make a difference. It's supposed to get within us and start to germinate as we come to understand it and experience it, transforming our lives as we find ourselves being born anew under its power, as we see it producing the fruit of God's will and God's purposes. That's the normal scenario, isn't it? That's what should be taking place out there in the world as the sower sows. But nevertheless, there are these examples, these situations where it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes it gets thrown on the path and the sun kills it. Sometimes the birds come and get it. Sometimes the thorns choke it out. Maybe part of the question is, which situation do you consider to be the normal situation in your life? Which is the situation that you would expect to happen? And which is the situation that's really abnormal? that's unusual? Do we find ourselves thinking sometimes that it's really more normal for us for it not to produce fruit, for the seed not to germinate, for something to happen to take it away? Oh yeah, it's tough, all the cares of the world, and those things happen, and it's hard to understand, and we get busy, and there's a lot upon us, and when the Word makes a difference in our life, it's really unusual. But Jesus is saying, don't get confused. Even out here in the world, in between the house and the boat, even out here where there are dangers, the promise is that the Word produces, that the seed takes root and grows, and you begin to understand and are transformed. If you're wondering about this, ask yourself, do I spend most of my time worried about the abnormal? Or am I spending most of my time trusting in the promise of what really will take place? Here we are in between the house and the boat, and the sower is still sowing. The sower is still sowing. What's going to happen for you? What are you going to hear? What's going to take root? What's going to grow? How are you going to change? What fruit are you going to see? If you know that's what really happens when God sows. Amen.